Members, the 5-minute break has ended. We'll resume our meeting. Please take a seat. I'll now open the floor to members of the panel or the Bills Committee. Should you wish to speak, please press the Request to Speak button. Each member would have 4 minutes to speak. First, Ms. Doreen Kong. Thank you, Chair. Having heard from the deputations or individuals, I think their comments are quite useful. I would like to make a few points. Well, having heard what the public said, it seems that many members of the public are not clear about the policy intent. Are we trying to minimize human-pigeon conflicts, or are we trying to punish those who have fed pigeons? Can the administration clarify the intent of the legislative amendments? I would also like to thank some of those who have spoken. Some may be experts in this regard, so I've learned quite a lot. And when these legislative amendments were submitted to us for our consideration, no studies have been attached. So I understand that the government has been working with experts, and I think that some scientific studies have been conducted. Well, as a member, I do want to know more before the passing of the bill. I want to refer to expert studies if such are available. Well, I think the administration should provide some scientific data for our consideration. Third, I would agree that some members of the public saying that increasing the penalties alone won't be enough. What else has the administration done? And in fact, is increasing the penalties the only or the best option? The government should be able to prove that. Lastly, pigeons have indeed caused a nuisance. But do we know what the root cause of the problem is? The problem with pigeons has persisted for many years. Are people feeding pigeons indeed out of kindness? No. In fact, in Singapore, in 2022 April to 2023 October, they have conducted a study. They have still 390 people who are still feeding animals, and 180 odd of them feeding feral pigeons. So the Singaporean government has studied the reason behind so. Apparently, it was found to be something with the mental well-being of the citizens. So they have involved some departments that would deal with well-being, such as the AIC. They have also worked with NGOs and private organizations to improve the mental health of individuals. Excuse me, Chair, I'll just finish this sentence. I understand the administration won't be able to give a response. I'm just giving an opinion.
Do you want a response from the administration? Just very briefly, please. Yes, please do. Very briefly, the purpose of the legislative amendment is to introduce a feeding ban of feral pigeons on top of that of wild animals. I think this is common knowledge, as many members know. 2 years ago, we expanded the feeding ban of wild animals, and we received some very clear requests from members to expand the feeding ban to cover feral pigeons as well. I will ask my colleague to answer the question on research. We conducted research on feeding ban practices, which are introduced in different jurisdictions. At least 15 of them have feeding bans in place. Singapore is one example. They have conducted research to demonstrate that the feeding ban of feral pigeons is effective and it does not affect their survival. So this is the research and scientific backing we rely on. We've mounted public education and sought to understand why some people feed pigeons. Starting from 2012, we have been mounting publicity and public education. We set up street booths. We hold seminars to get an understanding of those who would feed pigeons. We provide counseling to these people. Very often, these people are concerned that feral pigeons may have problem foraging for food, and we explain to them that they can survive in the current environment without human intervention. Next, Mr. Stephen Ho. Thank you, Chairman. I thank the deputations for coming and expressing their views. I've heard some polarized views. But first of all, I'd say that we should not put one against another, regardless of whether they support the bill or not. We're not mutually exclusive. There are ways to solve the problem. I understand many deputations used the exact wording that the government is taking a single approach. I think the government should explain their work to the public in a better way. Now, about what Ms. Doreen Kong said, it's not that I disagree with her. Of course, we can all chip in and decide the amount of fine to be imposed. But we must bear in mind that we are not going after pigeon lovers in general. We are targeting irresponsible people who feed pigeons. In fact, as per this amendment bill, the government is not ruling out other ways of feeding pigeons. For example, there are official channels for feeding pigeons with, say, contraceptive baits, as long as they receive the permit to do so. So it's not the case that by passing the bill, we are killing the pigeon population. Now, the government should be aware of this kind of conflict. I'd say that this is attributable to the lack of clear delineation of responsibilities among government departments. Now, just now, one deputation mentioned that at the moment, the offender would be fined for littering, and the penalty has gone up from $1,500 to $3,000. For litterbugs, I don't think pigeon lovers should condone them. Otherwise, we won't be able to forge consensus. So with the passage of the bill, the government should adopt a multi-pronged approach. I read the report. I don't know if this is the one that Ms. Lam also read. In some places, government agencies are allowed to feed the pigeons. Ordinary members of the public, however, are not allowed, and then designated spots can be set up for feeding somewhere far away from urban areas. So this is important. More importantly, we should prevent a general feeding of pigeons. And in fact, there were instances of avian flu virus being detected in the dead bodies of pigeons. So we also need to have regard the public health risk. I represent the agriculture and fisheries sector, and if this argument holds water, I would suggest that we should allow the keeping of live poultry, because likewise chicken vendors should be able to resume operation. There are so many conflicts among the different pieces of legislation. I don't think we will be able to forge consensus at a single meeting. But taking a more microscopic view, we should at least be able to eradicate the street hygiene problem. We should, control pigeon population and avoid overpopulation. We're not killing them. At least we should be able to make this decision. Whether or not this bill will be passed, we will continue to discuss this topic. There are different ways to address the issue. Now, perhaps the risk of avian flu has been overlooked. I checked some reports. At least several dozen people died as a result of contracting avian flu every year. So the government should explain the situation in a more dynamic manner. Any response? Yes, of course, we would urge the Legislative Council to pass the bill, but regardless of the outcome, we will continue to adopt a multi-pronged approach. That means public education, promoting contraceptives, etc. We will continue to take those forward. Next, Mr. Tony Jie. I thank individuals and deputations for expressing their views at the public hearing today on the legislative amendment. As far as I understand, most of the deputations are concerned about including feral pigeons in the feeding ban. And I agree with the deputations and members that the government has not fully explained to the public the operation of the bill. The ordinance is called Wild Animals Protection Ordinance. You need to explain to the public that feeding may not be good for feral pigeons. And what is the purpose of the bill? Are you trying to drive out the pigeon population altogether? As explained by the Deputy Secretary just now, the purpose is to achieve ecological balance. So the intention is good, but it seems that this is not agreed by some of the deputations. At least this is their perception. Well, there is a suggestion that because of feeding, it is difficult for the government department to drive the pigeon away. What is meant by that? To where will the pigeon be driven? Another suggestion is set up designated feeding areas. Of course, we need to strike a balance. Your intention is to protect the pigeon population, so the government should explain it very clearly. What about aviary? This is akin to the designated feeding spot. It can be effective if done properly. You can control pigeon population, especially in densely populated areas such as London. I think this measure is only introduced in London, where it is densely populated, but not elsewhere. So perhaps you can take a multi-pronged approach so that other measures can be implemented to achieve the so-called ecological balance. Any response from the government? I thank Mr. Chair for his comments. He talked about past incidents. As for the way forward, it is we will be happy to provide additional information. Now, he asked about pigeon houses or dovecotes. For pigeon species not kept in captivity, they have a natural habitat. Human feeding may affect their behavior. And as mentioned by some deputations, should we set up designated feeding spots or pigeon houses? And if we do that, can we guarantee that pigeons will not go elsewhere? So this is something we need to ponder as well. I'll give the floor to Mr. Chan. Let me supplement. Feral pigeons lived in the natural environment. There should not be excessive human intervention, including feeding. Feeding affects not only pigeons, but other natural species. As human beings feed pigeons, the pigeon population will expand rapidly. This will affect the ecological balance. There will also be inter-species competition. So feeding definitely affects the pigeon species as well as other species. As I mentioned, pigeons live in the natural environment, so it is not a concern that they might die for want of human feeding. In fact, according to research, such as one in Singapore, after introducing a feeding ban, pigeon population remains, only that they are dispersed to more rural areas instead of gathering in urban districts. There is no health risk for the pigeons or the public. So basically, the pigeons should be able to forage in nature.
Ms. Elizabeth Court. First, I would like to thank deputations and individuals attending the meeting. I do hear your views. Now, I believe why the legislative amendments were proposed is due to the fact that there were many complaints received, and indeed we do observe an environmental hygiene problem. I myself object to the feeding of wild animals in general, and it is because human feeding would cause a disruption in their behavior. But I'm glad that we have this opportunity to hear from people holding different views, and I'm glad that some animal rights organization representatives are indeed asking people not to feed pigeons. As I said, we do see nuisance being caused by feral pigeons, especially in relation to environmental hygiene. I myself followed up on the issue in Chengquan-o. After people have fed feral pigeons, they would not clean up the leftover food, and the leftover food would be eaten by other pests. Pigeons would often gather outside air conditioners of flats, and people can't even open their own windows. So I think we can tackle the issues one by one. Increasing penalties would definitely be effective, but I would say that indeed there may still be people feeding pigeons after the bill has passed. So then we will think of other measures to take. Honestly, I do not know whether with the legislative amendments there will indeed be a decrease in the numbers. The administration said the pigeons would disperse, and that is what I hope to see. We will have to see after the bill has passed. And it was said by a district councillor that there should be dispersal of pigeons once the feeding has stopped. Well, I think after the passing of the bill, we will see whether that will indeed be the case. As for the trial program on using contraceptive drugs to feral pigeons, the program was implemented in Saikong, and I observed myself there has not been a significant decrease in the number of feral pigeons. So I want to ask the administration if they have any plans after this program to tackle the problem of pigeons staying in urban areas. Regarding the construction of dovecotes, some people have come and speak to me about this issue. I myself disagree with animals being kept in captivity, but if them being in captivity can bring about benefits, I think it may be a good approach. But because do not have the relevant information at the moment, I will keep my stance neutral. I think the government should look into it to see if there are any pros and cons associated with it, and if it is found to be effective, I then may consider the following that option, but we need data to support any decisions being made. All right, administration, please. Thank you for the questions. As I said earlier, the consultant is currently analyzing the data collected for the trial program, and we will consider the consultant's recommendations to see if any other measures have to be devised. The proposed legislative amendments, with these, we believe that pigeons will return to nature, and in their natural conditions, their numbers should decrease. And it is shown in overseas studies that with the feeding ban, pigeons in other places have dispersed and will not remain in urban areas. So, with the proposed legislative amendments implemented, we will look at the relevant data to see if any other measures have to be implemented. Regarding the construction of dovecotes, we have looked into some studies about dovecotes keeping pigeons in captivity, essentially. But from what we can see, the effectiveness of the dovecotes is in doubt. Not only does it not achieve the intended purpose, with dovecotes being set up in certain urban areas, it would still affect their natural foraging behavior. Thank you. Well, I myself want to speak as well. This is my first round. I would like to thank deputations and individuals for attending the meeting. I do understand the intention of many attendees is that we do not want to hurt the pigeons, but for the area that I serve in Southeast New Territories, we do see the problem getting more serious. As for what we should do to achieve the policy intent to minimize nuisance costs to members of the public, I believe we need to communicate more with members of the public. And regarding whether with the feeding ban, pigeons would indeed go back to nature, I myself have some reservations, because I asked some experts if pigeons have to change their roosts, there may be more things that we have to do. And whether the legislative amendments are indeed the best option that we can take, I believe we would need to liaise with the relevant stakeholders to find out. In fact, I think representatives of the administration would understand that for those who have attended the meeting, they are just hoping that pigeons won't be hurt. And in fact, we heard from both sides that for some people, they think that if pigeons aren't fed, they would die. But then from the administration, they said feeding would actually make things worse. Lastly, I think we should think about where pigeons should go, whether they should go back to nature or whether they should settle in dovecotes. I think we can really talk about that. If there are any misconceptions about one thinking nature is not the best option for people, I think the government would have to clarify such misconceptions. And LegCom members, as a bridge between the government and the members of the public, can facilitate liaison between both sides. So I think the government can really do more in this regard. Anything to add, administration? I agree with what the chairman said, I have nothing else to add. Thank you. We have Mr. Lam Chen Sing speaking for the first round. Excuse me, because there is an other Bills Committee meeting in another conference room. I'm late here. I would like to thank deputations and individuals for attending the meeting. Some attendees are concerned about the enforcement situation. In fact, in the last meeting, I asked about the enforcement action plans that the department or the other departments are going to take. We would involve more departments, but specifically which grades will be involved, no information on that has been provided. I'm thinking if we can have dedicated enforcement teams that can carry out the relevant enforcement action patrols so as to increase deterrence, so that it won't be a one-off kind of enforcement action. If you have to ask LCSD members, staff members to enforce the relevant legislation in all parks, it would be difficult because LCSD staff officers do not carry out enforcement alone. They have to manage the parks. There's also paperwork to be filled in afterwards. It increases their workload, and that is not ideal. In fact, some LCSD staff members have asked some members of the public not to feed feral pigeons, and they were attacked as a result. If we have a dedicated enforcement team, you can provide training to members of the team. You may even equip them with cameras. And in fact, in the last meeting, I asked whether cameras will be provided to officers taking enforcement action. You said you would consider this option. So I want the government to provide any updates on implementation plans. And the SPCA submission mentioned that some drivers would throw food from their vehicles to feed feral pigeons. I don't know if it is something that happens frequently. If it is indeed the case, how will you take enforcement action? Will you take a picture and then send a ticket to them, just like the case with traffic contraventions? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lam, for your questions. I think what is important is to ensure effective enforcement. As for which grades will be involved and how many officers will be involved, I think we can provide an official written reply after the meeting so as to provide more details. If you would agree, yes, I do agree. As for enforcement details, I believe we discussed this briefly in the last meeting. It would depend on the circumstances of individual cases. We have to see whether the act of the citizen would constitute an act of feeding as deemed by officers of the relevant departments. I'll perhaps let Mr. Chan, the Assistant Director, supplement my answer.
Yes, Mr. Chan will supplement. Thank you, Chairman. In initiating prosecution, we will have regard to the observations made by our colleagues. Just now, my colleague mentioned drivers throwing food out of the window to feed pigeons. Well, that depends on the actual circumstances. If the vehicle has driven off, we will jot down the registration mark and then work with the transport department in identifying the driver for further investigation. Anything to add? If not, then that's the end for the first round. Mr. Stephen Ho would like to speak again. If there is no objection, I will allow a second round since we still have a lot of time before adjournment. Mr. Ho. Thank you, Chairman. The government should not say no outright to matters not related to the core principles, because it gives a perception to the public that the government is shutting its ears to suggestions. When it comes to environmental protection, things are constantly evolving. For example, today we're having this discussion. Are feral pigeons living in the wild, or are they domestic animals after all? Some refer to literature suggesting that they have been domesticated for 3,000 years. Now we have feral, but in Chinese they are called feral pigeons, or pigeons living in the wild. Likewise, we have stray dogs called feral dogs, feral cattle, etc. So unless you're absolutely sure, don't just say no outright to any suggestions to policy ideas. It may be due to some constraints in the current circumstances. This may also relate to hygiene. The government should go back and mull over these ideas. Well, there are so-called experts proposing different ways of tackling the problem. So I think that at least you should not rule out the possibility. I think this is the right attitude to adopt, because I do see the overlapping of environmental protection and environmental hygiene. Other members mentioned law enforcement. I think the problem stems from a lack of coordination among government departments. Now, can you explain to us, with the passage of the bill, how government departments will be empowered to take enforcement action? Well, of course, there will be a heavier burden on government departments. How are you going to deploy resources, for example? Say, for housing departments, are you going to designate just a handful of officers to take up this task, or will all officers be given the same powers? After all, there will be an enforcement issue. Now, after passage of the bill, even before the new measure is properly implemented, there will still be people in the coming year or so committing the same offense. They may be people with mental health needs. They may be people who are ignorant about the new legislation. They never read the news. So after the bill is passed, you should spend 2 years, 3 years, or even 1 year to collect data and report back to us to tell us whether you're achieving what you set out to achieve. If there is a departure from the original intent, you should devise ways and you should take remedial action. Tell us what to do. Any response from the administration? I thank Mr. Ho for his comments. I say this once again. We do keep an open mind about suggestions on top of what is set out in the legislation. Say for pigeon houses, like Mr. Ho said, an initial response should be given. Let me say that we're happy to take it up and study this option further. Mr. Ho asked whether we will assess the effectiveness of the bill after it's been implemented. Of course, we're happy to do that. We will report back to the relevant panel, for example, on whether there's been a reduction in complaint figures and the data about the pigeon population in general after introducing the feeding ban. Ms. Elizabeth Quat, I thank Mr. Stephen Ho for asking the question that I wanted to ask. Of course, we're talking about the ideal situation in which after the bill has been passed, no person will feed pigeons, and then the pigeons will disperse and move away from the residential areas. This is the ideal situation. But take wild pigs as an example. I am against hunting wild pigs. These wild pigs are used to living near human beings. They are used to foraging from rubbish bins. And when they are in despair for food, they attack human beings. So some people get injured as a result. They are sent to hospital. So I feel helpless, but to say yes to capturing the wild pigs in such instances. So the point is, right now we are not sure whether feral pigeon herds will be dispersed if feeding ban is introduced. That is why the government should take different preventive measures. Mr. Stephen Ho urged you to consider different options. I think that this is a pragmatic way to go. You cannot just rule out pigeon houses or contraceptive baiting because you're going to introduce the feeding ban. You need to keep all options open and be prepared for different scenarios. What if it doesn't work? A few months down the road, if we question you again, you may say, oh, we'll start another study, and that will be too late. Now, responding to Mr. Ho's question on keeping pigeons in captivity, well, I am, of course, no expert. I don't know whether pigeons are wild animals or domesticated animals. Still, I think you should collect data and be prepared for different scenarios. Next time, perhaps you can give us evidence to explain to us that pigeon aviaries simply don't work. And then we can have further discussion. Otherwise, if it works, then there is another option for us. Well, we have many parks in Hong Kong, and we can perhaps divert the pigeon population to parks, but not elsewhere. If you say this is not good for pigeons, and hence you're not taking this idea forward, then so be it. Otherwise, we have so many parks in Hong Kong. Say for Kowloon Park, we can build houses, keep them there for a while to control the population before releasing them back in nature. I don't know. I'm no expert. But the point is, we don't have empirical data right now to tell us whether it works or not. The government should conduct a research and tell us, and let the data speak. Now, if after passing the bill, the problem is totally eradicated, then there is no need to keep them in aviaries, as the nuisance has been addressed, and then we don't need a further discussion. But then at this stage, when the bill has yet to be passed, we need to keep an open mind. We need to be rational. We're all animal lovers. We are concerned about the welfare of wild animals, including feral pigeons. So we share the same goal. We also want streets in Hong Kong to be clean. We don't want any nuisance to the residents. We don't want complaints. A reply from the administration, please. Yes, of course, we keep all options open. We will try our best to conduct studies. Mr. Dennis Leung, Chairman, the objective of the amendment bill is to address environmental hygiene problems facing us. The problems are mostly caused by people feeding pigeons with leftovers and all sorts of debris. This sparks problems surrounding not only pigeons but other species and environmental hygiene as a whole. We don't want people feeding pigeons in crowded residential areas because it causes environmental hygiene problem. I'd like to address some of the points made about the testing on the dead bodies of pigeons. Some suggested that no avian flu virus was detected. Can you verify this information? Now, if the report is misleading, you need to level with the public. Have you received such cases or not? Please dispel any misunderstanding. Next, about domestic animals and wild animals and their relevant definitions. Last year, when we discussed a bill on the wild pigs, we discussed the same point. Now, these pigeons are feral pigeons. They are not really domesticated. They are only domesticated if they're kept in captivity. In fact, the government, since last year, has not truly explained to us the difference between wild and domesticated animals. There is now a misunderstanding in the community. You need to clarify it once and for all. Explain to the public what a wild animal means and what a domestic animal means. Next question for Dr. Jane Gray. Dr. Jane Gray, what happens if we do not feed wild animals? Will we affect the foraging habit or behavior? We are all animal lovers, but without human feeding, wouldn't it be better for animals? Thank you. First, let's hear from the administration. I thank Mr. Leung for the questions about the avian flu virus and the difference between the wild animal and a domesticated animal. I'll give the floor to Mr. Chan. About the definition, I will take this question, and then Dr. Lee will take the question on the avian flu virus. According to the ordinance, a wild animal is classified as animals other than a domestic animal in the common law. For feral pigeons, the species itself is called rock pigeon, and then after being kept in captivity and domesticated by human beings for years, they are domesticated. As for what feral means, it means that the species have been released back to the nature. So they are domestic animals released into nature, and that is why they are called feral pigeons, which are domesticated. Now, just like dogs, human beings have domesticated dogs for thousands of years. They are not wild animals. So despite being called feral pigeons, they are domestic animals living in the wild. The doctor can supplement on the avian flu virus.
Yeah.
Regarding what members asked about avian flu cases in feral pigeons, indeed, we rarely found avian flu virus in feral pigeons compared to water birds or poultry, but there is always such possibility because they are, after all, birds. To dispel the concerns of the public, we will test samples of feral pigeons to see if there is avian flu. There is always the associated risk because the virus would evolve too, so we have to maintain high alert. All right, Dr. Jane Gray, please.
Asking the question. The SPCA is against feeding of wild animals, particularly wild boars, feral cattle, the buffalo, because it does increase their habituation to, as I said in my speech, and it causes a lot more human-animal conflicts. These animals do have enough food in the wild, and they can exist on their own. Pigeons, obviously, are slightly different, but obviously, if they're given the chance, they will find, and the German report does actually mention that they do find food elsewhere. So if you actually read the whole report and don't focus on specific areas, and I think one thing I really would like to point out is the SPCA sees this bill is holistic. It needs to have other things in place, as we've said, and it's really important that we change people's behaviour, because as people's behaviour is increasing, with increasing urbanisation, us feeding is just bringing the animals closer to us and causing more conflict, which is neither good for humans or for animals. I hope that helps to answer your question.
Okay.
All right, members. After several rounds of questions and after the deputations and individuals have spoken, I believe there have been exchanges of views. It may not be an in-depth exchange session today, but I believe the public hearing allowed the administration to consider different views when formulating policies in future. And members have heard the views of attendees. We will incorporate your suggestions when we make suggestions to the administration in future. As said earlier by members, we have a common goal to protect animals here. So the administration can listen to the different groups still in future, and we will act as a bridge still in future. This is the end of the discussion of this item. I would like to thank attendees for attending the meeting. You may now leave. Members, we will move on to the next agenda item. The matters arising from the meeting on the 18th of December. Colleagues, the administration has given a written response to issues raised at the meeting on 18th of December. That is LC paper number CB brackets 12/2024 brackets 02. Will the administration's representative please brief members on the relevant paper? Please turn on the microphone for the public officer. Thank you, Chair. We have given a written reply in relation to the issues regarding the comparison of the statutory powers and functions of authorized officers and specified officers. Right now, the authorized officers would include AFCD officers as well as police officers. Apart from enforcing the ordinance, they will also regulate acts such as hunting, intentional disturbance, and other acts relating to protected wild animals. They can also inspect proof of identity of the relevant individuals and make arrests. They can also seize evidence and enter premises. We have introduced a fixed penalty regime. So the authorized officers, that is police officers and AFCD officers, will continue to issue fixed penalty notices. We have given them the power in the bill to do so, that is to issue fixed penalty notices and inspect people's proof of identity. And as said in the paper, with the feeding ban being expanded to cover all of Hong Kong, we want to expand the officers involved to include officers from other departments. That is the FEHD, LCSD, and Housing Department officers, because they will only enforce the relevant legislation regarding the feeding ban. It will not be appropriate to include them in the category of authorized officers. We have thus included the category of specified officers to allow them to issue fixed penalty notices to those who have contravened the feeding ban. Regarding the definition or meaning of feeding, after consulting legal advice, there is no definition of feed or feeding in the legislation of Hong Kong. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, feed means to give food to or to supply with food, and feeding is the action of feed. And having consulted the Department of Justice, there is no need to specifically define certain words if the words are just conveying their general meanings. And regarding court cases, especially convicted cases involving feeding of wild animals, no definition has been made in these cases, but we have provided some cases for members' reference in the paper. Regarding prosecution, we will collect the relevant evidence such as what food has been fed, the amount, the number of times of feeding, and so on. After considering the circumstances, we will decide whether to issue fixed penalty notices. And what we are doing right now is consistent with what is proposed in the bill. Should people wish to raise a defense, the case will be brought to court and the court will decide on the relevant case. Regarding the operation of the proposed new Schedule 9, it is, as said, a new proposal relating to fixed penalty regulations, and this is consistent with Chapter 611, that is the Motor Vehicle Idling Fixed Penalty Ordinance. It allows for defenses to be raised for fixed penalties, and this is largely similar to other fixed penalty regimes that we have. Thank you. if members have any questions about the administration's written response, please press the request to speak button. If not, members, it's Mr. Stephen Ho. Well, I hope that the administration can talk about the issue of identification documents for the LCSD officers. For example, do they have to show a document, or do they show their warrant cards to the relevant individuals in order to inspect the proof of identity of those who have been suspected of feeding wild animals? Well, thank you. It is said that we will require a written document, and we are thinking it would be in the form of a letter. We have referred to another chapter that is 599G for the relevant arrangements. Well, is it the case that the warrant card of housing department officers would work? Is that something that you already have in mind, or are you still open to different options? Well, indeed, we are still at the stage of scrutinizing the bill, so this is still open to discussion, but we have referred to other legislation such as Chapter 599G, Prevention and Control of Disease, Prohibition Ordinance. But again, we'll keep our minds open. Please turn on the microphone for the member. Thank you. Chair, I would like to follow up on the distinction between wild animals and domesticated animals. I think relying on the legal definition alone is not enough. Pigeons have been domesticated for thousands of years, and Hong Kong is an urban city. I hope that you can liaise with the professors in the field to see if there is any need to make changes to the definition of domesticated animals. Thank you. Any response from the administration? Thank you, Chair. Regarding the definition specified, as said, we followed the definitions in the existing legislation, but we can definitely review the definitions concerned. Thank you. Well, Mr. Stephen Ho, please be brief. Well, I think it's very hard to reach a consensus on the definitions. I have referred to the laws of the mainland as well as the UK. I mentioned the distinction between bone skeletons or crematory remains is very minor, and would I deal with a particular kind of material would make me committing an offense of illegally dealing with carcasses. Well, I can't really say. I think we are dealing with the ordinance of protecting wild animals here, and we should take a more macro perspective. We should not deal with such minor details. We will always have new definitions floating around. So I think we shouldn't be discussing the relevant issue here. Well, I think we do understand the concerns of members regarding definitions. I hope the administration will take the relevant suggestion in mind. This is the end of the item.
草案嘅
So, members, before the clause-by-clause scrutiny, are there any other questions on policy issues? Well, some members are unable to attend today's meeting. So at the next meeting, I will ask members again whether there are further questions on policy issues. If all the issues have been addressed, we'll move on to the clause-by-clause scrutiny. But that ends today's meeting. As for the next meeting date, members will be informed by the Secretariat. We need to work out the time with the administration. I thank the administration and members for attending. Thank you.